It is Sunday the 12th of February 2017. I'm in front of the Unitarian Church in Montreal, engaged in my alternative spiritual practice of protesting against Unitarian Universalist injustices, abuses, and hypocrisy. Just finished up a half hour or so of protesting and starting up another half hour or so, I think, and a fresh segment of video. I was discussing Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's obscene and sadistic sodomy fantasy and the outrageously hypocritical double standards that the Unitarian Universalist Association and Unitarian Universalists more generally apply when, ministers behave badly. And so the video ended a little abruptly because the battery was dying. It's all right, I'll get that. It's okay, I can take care of it. Oh. What's that?
Aren't you cold?
Not as cold as some of the people inside. Sorry about that, but so this woman who's actually entering the Unitarian Church sees my picket signs get blown down by the wind and actually basically goes to help pick them up, which is kind of nice. And then she asks if I'm cold, and of course referencing Ralph Waldo Emerson's famous statement about the corpse cold Unitarianism of Brattle Street. In other words, referring to the emotional coldness of Unitarianism, because at that time there was no merger of Unitarian and Universalism. I basically said, well, I'm not as cold as some of those Unitarians in the building. And yes, there's some very, very cold-hearted Unitarian Universalists here in Montreal. Say nothing of elsewhere in the Unitarian Universalist religious community. Corpse cold Unitarianism is alive and well in more ways than one. Anyway, getting back to the outrageously hypocritical double standards of the Unitarian Universal Association, which is one example of corpse cold Unitarianism. I was able to sort of buttonhole UUA President Peter Morales. I believe it was just before the lunch hour. It might have been during a break before the lunch hour. So essentially, he was standing a few feet away from me. And I just straight up asked him, I said, I can't remember my exact words off the top of my head. They might be written down somewhere. But essentially asked him to reopen and re-examine my clergy misconduct complaints against Reverend Ray Drennan and Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein. That in my view, they had not been properly handled. In my view, they had not been handled in a manner that lived up to Unitarian Universalist principles of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And so I was asking him to ensure that the UUA reopened and re-examined them, from the perspective of basically an appeal and agreeing that actually they were legitimate complaints and doing something about it. Reverend Dr. Peter Morales' response was very blunt. He said, we're not reopening something that's years and years and years old. That's a very accurate quote. So we're not reopening, re-examining this stuff because it's old. It's years and years and years old. So he just totally refused to good day, sir. To re-examine my complaints against Reverend Ray Drennan and Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, basically letting the decisions stand as they were. what is interesting, again, this is April of 2010. So what happens in June of 2012, in fact, it was Friday, June 1st of 2012, I looked in my email inbox, and there was an email from Stikeman Elliott, barristers and solicitors litigation lawyer, Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe. The email itself didn't say very much. It said, please refer to the PDF attachment. So there was a PDF attachment, and so I went and I opened it up, and what the PDF attachment was a 2-page cease and desist demand letter that, amongst other things, accused me of threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein because I had criticized her sodomy fantasy. In fact, the way the letter was worded, it was almost as if it was saying that I was falsely accusing Reverend Victoria Weinstein of having a sodomy fantasy. It was almost like trying to deny that she actually had a sodomy fantasy. Just basically, I'm defaming her, even in saying she has a sodomy fantasy, let alone, the details of the criticism. So I found this very interesting. Here we are, 2+ years after Reverend Dr. Peter Morales said that the UUA was not reopening something years and years and years old, and here it is reopening Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy and other things that were even older. So I found that quite hilarious. But of course they were reopening from the perspective of accusing me of sexual harassment of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, to say nothing of another Unitarian Universalist minister, and even falsely accusing me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel for blogging about Unitarian Universalist pedophiles and rapists. But we're going to stick for now to the sodomy fantasy thing, because here's the outrageously hypocritical double standard. The UUA, when I complain about Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy, pretends that it's not their problem because it's outside of her role as a minister. But years later, it's accusing me of sexually harassing her, even threatening her and defaming her for criticizing her sodomy fantasy. And again, what is truly outrageously hypocritical is there's my criticism of Reverend Dr. Weinstein's sodomy fantasy. It did mock her, it did ridicule her, made fun of her, as it were, but there's nothing threatening in it. There was nothing in my criticism of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy that posed any kind of threat against her. It did not defame her in any way because it was totally truthful. I mean, I was not saying anything remotely untruthful about Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein and or her sodomy fantasy. I don't quite see how criticizing her obscene and sadistic sodomy fantasy could be seen as sexual harassment of her. And this is the interesting thing, is if you look at Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy, as she expressed it, and I'll repeat it one more time. Here's my sodomy fantasy: South Dakota State Senator anally impaled on the Statue of Liberty's torch. I don't know, but that sounds a lot more like threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of Senator Bill Napoli, then my criticism of it sounds like threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein. So again, it just shows the hypocritical double standards that are, you know, literally, that's insane, really. I mean, it's insane to pretend that Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy is basically, you know, not the UUA's problem, because that's essentially what they said. You know, it's not our problem because it's outside of her role as a minister. Well, if it's outside of her role as a minister and I'm criticizing it, then how can you pretend that you know, I'm sexually harassing a minister if it's outside of a role as a minister? It's just stupidity and foolishness, and of course, you know, not just stupidity and foolishness, but very immoral, very unethical, more than a little bit corrupt, just a tad evil behavior on the part of the Unitarian Universalist Association. So yeah, that's I think a pretty good example of the outrageously hypocritical standards that the Unitarian Universalist Association practices. And it really is, in terms of what I've actually experienced and in terms of what I've seen and observed, an incredibly corrupt and morally and ethically bankrupt organization, at least when it comes to how it handles complaints about clergy misconduct of all kinds, both sexual and non-sexual. Yes, there's been a few cases, a small number of cases, where Unitarian Universalist ministers have faced a certain amount of accountability for clergy sexual misconduct. But it's only the most egregious cases, or perhaps cases where the minister, you know, had sexual misconduct with the wrong person. In other words, you know, the minister made the mistake of having a sexual misconduct incident with, you know, someone who was a big donator to the church or a prominent member of the church or something like that, you know. I cannot go into too much speculation, but I think that if you look at the situation, I think you would find something along those lines. I think you would find that those cases where the clergy sexual misconduct was actually taken halfway seriously were because it was just incredibly egregious to the point of being criminal. And so, and not only that the minister in question was actually, you know, charged with a crime and even convicted of a crime. And so the UUA had very little choice but to, you know, defellowship the minister. But when you get beyond that, I think what you would find is that, you know, in cases where the victim or victims were not, you know, prominent church members, were not big donators to the church, chances are pretty good that they were dismissed and blown off, and that they only dealt with cases where it was, you know, someone who was a prominent church member, a big donator, you know, someone who had some clout, as it were, you know, that then they would deal with it somewhat seriously. Or another one would be just the sheer quantity. If the minister, you know, had basically had affairs with, you know, several of the congregants' wives or whatever, you know, when there was basically just a lot of the clergy misconduct, even if it wasn't, rape and pedophilia, but, having affairs and making sexual advances to congregants, if there was a lot of it, such as the case of Reverend Calvin O'Dame, and I'm trying to remember the name of the Santa Barbara minister off the top of my head. I can't remember his name, Italian name. But, in cases where literally, half a dozen or more people were victims, and that's another situation where the UUA might take the clergy misconduct complaints somewhat seriously. And when it gets right down to it, even when the Unitarian Universalist Association does take the clergy sexual misconduct complaints seriously, not much really happens to the minister. They're usually persuaded to resign, so they don't face any, big scandal. They just quietly resign. Sometimes they're even shunted off to another church. I've seen credible testimony from Unitarian Universalists who ought to know what they're talking about how Unitarian Universalist ministers who were found guilty of clergy sexual misconduct at one church, they resigned, they were pushed out, but then they were placed in another Unitarian church, down the road a little bit. One person in particular said he knew of 3 such cases, and this is just one person. So this is one person, longtime Unitarian Universalist, who I have no reason to doubt, saying that they knew of 3 cases, 3 different